The default option in every area of life is always the most expensive option. In this episode, I discuss how to forge a compelling future by paving your own path, as opposed to taking the default options that society presents us with. This is Dollars and Nonsense. If you follow the herd, you will be slaughtered. All right, everyone, welcome back to the show. You know, this is a topic I've talked about before, and I wanted to reiterate this because I just see it cropping up so often in our lives that society presents default plans to achieve a myriad of goals. You know, goals in every area of your life. There's some sort of default option, and it oftentimes, the default option is almost always the most expensive way to get it done, is the worst way to get it done, the slowest way to get it done. The default tends to be the worst. So you get surprised by the fact that it's the default option. And I want to hit this home a few times. I will say, just to kind of preface the whole episode though, that the best way to get out of the default herd mentality, you know, that's why we say if you follow the herd, you will be slaughtered. That's mainly saying we're bucking the default options to forge our own path, one that's far more compelling and far more profitable, and results are far more, beneficial in the forging your own path. So what I'm trying to get at there though was by saying the default option is normally you escape the default option whenever you add strategy to your life. That's the first principle here. The default option exists apart from strategy. That's kind of what makes it the default. You don't have to do anything. You find yourself in the herd heading towards a certain goal that was probably decided for you by somebody else. And the only way to get out of the default option is to incorporate strategy that will be a better way of achieving the end goal. And so there's some areas that this makes a lot of sense, and you can see it right away. And what we mean by saying the default option is the most expensive way to achieve anything. You know, the default option for, let's say, paying taxes. Let's use that. I've got plenty of examples. But the default option when you go pay taxes is really just to pay the most tax that you possibly can for the amount of income that you earn. So if you were just to go out and do your own tax return, and by the way, if you're like a W-2 employee or you don't have very much complex tax scenario, there's probably not a lot you can do to change it. But if you're in business or if you're an investor, there are probably things you could do to lower your tax bill. But the default option is just to fill out the 1040 forms and just send it to the IRS, and you'll end up, it's the most expensive option because it requires you to pay the most tax. However, think about it this way too. This is where there's some confusion in these types of ideas. Doing your own taxes is technically free in some ways, right? This is why it can be very confusing. So in other words, if you go do your own taxes, the default option of doing your own taxes is not knowing a whole bunch of things about the tax code that you don't know. You just know what you do know. So you go out and you do your own tax. You don't pay anybody to do anything. You just file it yourself. And so some people maybe should do that because there's just so little going on in their tax liability. But if we go out and we actually focus on the people who can add tax strategy to the mix, you now actually have to hire somebody though. So it's a little bit, so this is why it can be confusing. The default option is almost always free. It's almost always easy. It's almost always convenient, and it's always the worst way to do anything. That's the give and take, the yin and yang of living life in the default. So the next option would be, okay, if I was to go hire a CPA to help me lower my tax liability, I have to now pay money to them. So Nate, you're here telling me the default option is the most expensive and worst way to do it, but now you're actually saying me to go hire somebody to do it. I'm like, yeah, the whole goal of having the CPA and investing is to help have him or her create a world in which you're paying less in tax, so the money you pay the person to do your tax returns is actually coming back to you in tax savings. It becomes an investment by adding tax strategy. So there is no such thing as tax strategy when you fill out your own 1040, unless you're really good at doing taxes. I guess I should put that caveat in. But for most of us, the default tax option is pay the most tax you possibly can for the income you make. And the only way to not do that anymore is to hire a consultant, a CPA or somebody, to come in and offer you a strategy to reduce the tax. So you have to spend some money, but you end up making it in return. The same thing goes in almost every area of life. Like the default financial, savings for the future option is provided by banks with checking accounts and savings accounts and things like that. That's essentially the default option. If you just were to live life and get away from just living on cash, I guess, with envelopes, and you were to take the default step in the financial world is opening a checking or savings account in a bank. And once again, you find the same conundrum. The default way of building wealth is bank accounts. It's also the worst way, and everyone listening to the show would know that. It's the worst way to build wealth is just to store up your money in checking and savings accounts. It's also free. It's convenient. It's easy. It's the default. It's just the worst because there's no strategy involved when you open a bank account. You're not strategically doing anything. It's the default, convenient, free, easy option that happens to also be the worst and most expensive way to achieve wealth. So to put it this way, if you wanted to become financially free, the most expensive way to do that would be to store up money in checking and savings accounts with the goal of becoming financially free someday. If you want to build a wealth that allows you to have work become optional, to be totally financially free with passive income, the worst way to do it would be, the most expensive way to do it would be to just save money in checking and savings accounts for the future. You'd have to put the most money into those things compared to other alternatives. The issue with the non-default option, when you start transitioning away from the default option, is you start adding costs to it. So that's why I'm saying there's kind of a conundrum here, is that whenever you're going into a bank account, oftentimes there's just free checking accounts, free savings. You don't have to spend any money. So when they're saying it's the most expensive route, people get confused. It's free. But free, it also oftentimes comes at a huge cost. Huge cost. It's free to do your own taxes, but you might be leaving a ton of money on the table. And we're going to keep hitting this point. So if you transition away from the default checking and savings accounts, the next most defaulty thing to do, step up from that, would be like a 401k at work or something like that, or opening up an IRA account or something of that sort, where you're now, as you know, I'm not a huge fan of those either for many, many reasons. But what I'm saying is now you're adding a little bit of strategy. You're doing things that are not just totally the default. They're pretty close to the default these days, but they're not totally the default. So hopefully it'll be a step up from just letting money sit in checking and savings accounts. And what I'm trying to bring up though is whenever you transition to maybe an IRA or a 401k or something like that, you start adding fees to it, right? That's what you start doing. There's a cost to doing that. You have to hire a money manager. You have to pay mutual fund fees. You have to pay 401k fees. There's some sort of fee involved with making that transition to a different, hopefully better alternative than the basic alternative. But then you go even further beyond that, and you do what we love to do, which is actually creating an empire of sorts, where you're not saving for retirement. You're adding a much larger picture scope. You're becoming more of an entrepreneur and actively involved with your money as opposed to passively involved. Now you're really starting to implement strategy, and you might be getting into things that cost a lot of money. Real estate's kind of expensive to get into, right? You got to pay realtor fees when you buy. You got to pay realtor fees when you sell. You got to pay, mortgages. You got mortgage costs. Getting into the world of real estate is actually quite expensive to get into. Like, there's a lot of cost there that doesn't exist in the checking and savings account, but just because there's cost doesn't mean that it's worse. And that's what I think some people get caught up in. Just because something costs money doesn't mean it's worse. The checking and savings accounts don't cost anything, but they are the worst thing to do when your actual goal is building financial freedom. The things that cost money to get into are far more valuable than the things that are free and default. The same thing goes, and I don't mean to keep beating the dead horse here, but what I'm saying is by adding layers of strategy, additional layers of strategy and ownership and activity on your part, you can get off the default pattern and you can achieve financial freedom, wealth, and the things that you are wanting to be doing in the financial world. You can achieve it much faster when you get off the default, spend a little bit of money, and take things to the next level. The default option, if we do one more example, the default option for when you pass away is actually just to let the government decide what happens to all your assets and money. So the default option whenever you pass away is to go through the probate process. It's the most expensive option that exists. If you were to, let's say you build up a huge empire and you're worth $50 million, and you have this $50 million estate, and the most expensive option is the default option, is to do nothing to prevent enormous amounts of estate tax. So not only if you did no planning whatsoever and you just passed away with your $50 million estate, you would have spent no money hiring attorneys or building trusts or buying insurance, or you would have spent nothing doing any of that. And so it felt free to you. There's no cost for you to do nothing. The default is just nothing. You just had no plan whatsoever. And yet when you pass away, all of your assets go through probate. That's when all the attorneys are going to be hired. That's when there's a huge mess. The government's going to decide everything that happens to your money. And you're going to have this huge estate tax bill on your estate. And so what was the default option, which was to have no plan whatsoever, no strategy involved, the default option, which was free. You're just in it by default. There's no cost to you to be in the default option typically. That's the idea of the default. There's no cost to you, but you would have had to spend money to add strategy, to get out of the default, to end up achieving a better result. So if you spent no money, had no strategy, just part of the default, it's the most expensive way to transfer money to the next generation. You're going to pay the most amount of estate taxes possible. You're going to pay the most amount of attorney and legal fees after death, and allow the government to essentially, based on its own rules and regulations, decide who gets what and how much is going to get passed out and how long it's going to take, and you're at their mercy. Nobody wants that, but yet there's so many people who live in the default in every area of life. So if you have a $50 million estate, you can start to create strategies in advance that are going to cost some money, per se, to hire the people, to build the trust, to do the things that need to be done, to where you can avoid probate, avoid the extremely expensive cost of managing that type of estate through a probate process, and you can include tactics that would reduce your estate tax exposure to begin with. So you may be able to pass away with a $50 million estate, but only pay taxes as if the estate's $30 million, as opposed to $50 million, because you added, you may have spent $100,000 hiring people to build out a trust system, even $500,000. If you have a $50 million estate, I don't care the money. You could spend $1 million to have somebody build a system to where whenever you pass away, you can pass $50 million, but only be taxed as if you were passing $30 million through maybe like an irrevocable life insurance trust or a spousal lifetime access trust or the various other forms of irrevocable trust that you can set up to pass down money outside of the estate tax scenario, or at least reduced exposure to estate tax. So suddenly, the difference between a guy leaving $30 million of a taxable estate compared to $50 million of a taxable estate is about $10 million in estate tax. So, that $20 million difference at about 50% estate tax is $10 million. So you could have spent $500,000 to set it up to save $10 million. That's a no-brainer, but it would have required you to spend the money right now. It's an expense that the individual who saved the estate tax money, if he decided to do default and do nothing, just leave it up to probate, pay the max estate tax, pay the max attorney fees and probate costs, and leave it up to probate completely. That's the default option, most expensive by default. Listen to this, he would not have had to pay anything or do anything in his lifetime. It's an expense after death. All of it would have been handled by everyone else. It was an expense after death. He would have had no worries while he was alive, he or she. It would have been only occurring after death. That's why the default option is often sneaky, because it's always the easiest, default, convenient option. It's the most expensive option. But the question is, if you were to hire all these people and spend the money to save money in the future, the question is, how long of a time frame should we really be looking at the default options? And that's one of the things that I wanted to bring up to this. The same thing is, let's say the person wanted to incorporate a strategy in which they hired an attorney or something like that, or hired an accountant or whatever it is. In whatever goal you have, just understand that the default option, it takes no strategy and is oftentimes essentially free or at almost no cost. And anytime you add strategy, you can get off the default option, but it oftentimes involves some sort of cost. You have to spend some money either hiring somebody or doing something yourself or putting money into something that has some form of cost, but it actually ends up being way less expensive to achieve your goal than doing the free thing. So the bank accounts are the free thing, and they actually are the worst thing that you could ever do to achieve the goal of financial freedom. Everything else that's better than the free thing has a cost to it, but it also helps you achieve financial freedom better than the free thing. That's always that's the conundrum with the default option.
Are you tired of feeling like everyone has their hand in your pocket? At Living Wealth, we believe in challenging the status quo. After all, most of those conventional tools only seem to make someone else rich. Let us show you how to take back control by banking on yourself. Visit livingwealth.com livingwealth.com/escapethebank. You'll receive instant access to what we call the beginner's course. This free, in-depth, easy-to-follow course teaches people how to create and profit from infinite banking. We not only discuss the philosophy and principles behind infinite banking, but also offer real-life examples to demonstrate how it works. Even folks experienced with infinite banking often tell us they learned a ton too. So, it's worthwhile regardless of your experience level. Stop letting banks and Wall Street dictate your financial future. Again, that's livingwealth.com/escapethebank to gain access to the free course today. Now back to Nate and Holly.
If we go back to the estate style issue, if the person was to go hire an attorney and was to say, I've got a $50 million estate, I want to try to preserve this as much as possible and leave as much as possible to my heirs with as little tax as possible, that they would start recommending things. One of the things they oftentimes would recommend would probably be some sort of life insurance trust, some sort of irrevocable life insurance trust. There's a few different varieties where the trust takes a policy out on you. And so the trust owns a policy on you, but when the death benefit proceeds are received by the trust upon your death, so the trust is the owner, you're the insured, those death benefit proceeds pass outside of your estate. So the only estate issue would be the amount of premium that was contributed to the trust, the amount of contributions made to the trust, that would still qualify as part of your estate. But all of the death benefit proceeds, which are going to be way larger, pass outside of probate. But here's what we're trying to say. Or here's what I'm trying to get at. The default option where you didn't do any of that meant you didn't have to pay the attorney $20,000 or whatever it is to build out the trust system. And you wouldn't have had to pay for a policy. You wouldn't have to put money into a policy, which all of us know that policies have a cost to them. It definitely had a cost to it. So you would have had to, everybody knows you would have had to hire an attorney to do it. You would have had to buy a policy, which has some costs associated with that, of course, as well. But suddenly, you are no longer on the default option. You have added a strategy that is going to allow you to leave more money with less tax than if you did nothing. And that's the goal. That's the goal of getting off the default option. And that's one of the things I'm trying to hit on, when people are deciding maybe even to do infinite banking. I think the question is, whenever you're trying, infinite banking requires you to get out of the default option financially. Like that's one of the callings. If you're going to go down this path, you're definitely getting out of the default option of banking. So fundamentally, as we've already said, checking and savings accounts are free to be a part of. They're the default banking option available. Checking accounts, savings accounts, and bank loans to handle all your financial, financing, liquidity concerns. You can handle that at a bank, or you can go down this IBC route. To go down the IBC route, of course, you're no longer in the free world of no strategy. Strategy is done for you by the bank. All you do is you just step in, it's default. And free, convenient, easy. If you're going to incorporate IBC, you're going to launch a banking strategy that you control. And so the question is, okay, well, doing IBC has a cost to it. You're going to pay premiums into a policy. The policy is going to be producing cash value, but you're not profitable day one. It's not like depositing money in a bank account. You're launching a policy that you're going to use as your banking enterprise. And so, of course, there's going to be a cost to it. The question is, what time frame is a fair time frame to assume if the cost is worth it to you or not? This is one of the things we've been beating with from every angle in this podcast, is the idea that I don't think people look at long enough time frames in the grand scheme. They don't look at a long enough time frame to understand what their actions are occurring. Just like the estate planning individual, he may have been building this estate for his entire lifetime. And he decided to, and the idea is this, he could do nothing, add no strategy, just simply do the default option of probate, no plans, and he could spend no money hiring anybody for 30 years, 40 years, 50 years, whatever it is. That is the most expensive way to pass, a large wealth estate is through the probate process. Max estate tax, max attorney costs, and you let the government decide who gets all your money. That's ridiculous. So what we're saying, though, in the same vein as that, is that the question is, which one is more expensive? Is it more expensive to do the free default banking option, of which case you put $1 in day one and you can take out $1 right away? There's no cost really in the vast majority of checking and savings accounts. I know there are some that have fees, but for the most part, let's just say it's all free. So you have no cost on one thing, you have cost on the other. And the question is, which one is the most expensive route to achieve your banking needs of life? We would say by far and away, the default free option is the most expensive way to achieve banking independence. To be free from the banks, be able to control and build profit from the banking side of things. It's the most expensive way. But the question is, here's the reality. You can only tell if it's more expensive or less expensive by looking at a long time horizon. Because we all know that one is free and one is cheap. But that's the way it works in almost every area of life. The default option for health and wellness is to do nothing and sit around on the couch watching TV. That's the default. You have to start spending money to get a gym membership or to hire a trainer. Natural food and healthy food and organic food is more expensive than processed food. It's the default. It's the cheapest. It's the easiest. It's also the worst for you. And I'm guilty of this, especially in my diet and my exercise routines are not very diligent. But what I'm saying is if your goal is to get in shape and to be healthy, you're going to have to spend some more money than the other guy that doesn't have that goal. But you're going to spend money to achieve a much greater, benefit in life. I'm just trying to reiterate that the default option in life is always the worst way to achieve goals. It's the most expensive in the grand scheme of things. Who cares if you save some money by eating the cheap stuff for your entire life if you have to die at age 70, as opposed to eating healthy stuff and die at age 85? It becomes less expensive to eat the healthy food because you're able to have your brain and your body is able to work for a much longer period of time to generate more and more wealth and to build the empire that you want to build. So what I'm saying is the default option is always the most expensive. It's obviously true in the world of IBC as well. It's the most expensive way to do it. As far as building a bank, conventional banking is very expensive to you don't make any money in the grand scheme of things, or very little money. Whereas with IBC, you can create generational wealth, tax-free inside the policy, but you do have to be willing to implement the strategy, learn the strategy, and understand that the strategy is going to have some cost. It's not just a free lunch. You don't just get to start a policy and get involved with IBC without nothing. The question is, which one is the most expensive route? Well, you should definitely be looking over a long time horizon. Everything financially should be seen over a long time horizon. The goal of planning financially is not what costs the least amount of money right now. The question is, what helps me achieve my objectives and create the most amount of value for me over a long period of time? Because if every decision you ever made was just the cheapest route to achieve something, then you're going to follow the default path as closely as possible, and you'll get default path results. If you want to get off the path, you start implementing strategy, more innovative strategy that's not a part of the default culture. And you only implement the strategy to get off the default to achieve better results than everyone else is getting. And that's fundamentally where we end this, is that the goal of life is not to get the default option, not to be average, but it's to be exceptional. The only way to be exceptional is to get off the default path. The default path is always easy, convenient, and free, practically speaking. It's also the most expensive, costly, worst path to achieve most people's goals. The question is, do you have the courage to break out? And are you willing to take some risks and try new things, involve some change to get off the default path, add a strategy that can change things? For most financial problems, the cost of the problem is seen over a lifetime, over a long time horizon, not when it's due. So you spend money now, but on various things, but to make more money as time goes on. And that's the world of entrepreneurship, that's the world of business, that's the world of investing, that's the world of IBC as well. So one of the things that if I wrap up the episode, is just to fully comprehend to yourself that spending money to get away from the default is not always a bad thing. In fact, anytime you implement a strategy in life, it oftentimes has some sort of cost, economic cost associated with it. And the only reason anyone chooses to take the cost, the only reason you choose, why would you ever go put money in a 401k when you can put money in your checking account? The 401k has a fee to it. They're going to charge you, the mutual fund's going to charge you fees. The bank's not charging you fees. Why don't you just stay with the bank? It's the cheapest option. Go ahead and stay with the bank. Of course, that's ridiculous because the end result is far different. And then to go even beyond the 4K, well, why would you ever go become an entrepreneur when you can just be an employee, work a steady job, and contribute to a 401k? Why don't you choose that life as your life? It's the default life. it has a certain end result, and you can do it pretty consistently. It's default, it's simple, it's easy, it's convenient for the most part. And the world of entrepreneurship and active investing is more difficult. It creates strategy. There's some risk involved. You have to accomplish things yourself. But what I'm here to tell you, and I'm here to tell the world as much as I possibly can, that the default option, while it's easy and cheap and convenient and free, possibly in the moment, it always comes with expense that is seen longer. And then the reverse is true. Most financial or life strategies involve some sort of effort or cost in some way to get off the default, and so you see a cost now, but in exchange you receive a huge benefit. You have forged your own path, different than the default, that's better than the default, to achieve the future that you want to achieve in a much shorter time frame and a much bigger capacity by adding strategy. Well, that's one of the reasons why we love IBC, Infinite Banking, using these policies to forge a different path than the default banking path that will result in far more wealth being created without having to change much about what you're doing, but just by adding a strategy to the mix. I hope this has been helpful. Once again, the only way we're promoting this show and getting the reach out to the people that would love to be a part of this movement is through you guys. It's the grassroots method. It's the listeners. It's the audience. And so once again, I just ask if you're enjoying the show, if it's meaning something to you, if you're receiving benefit from the episodes, if you wouldn't mind taking a moment and writing a review wherever you consume the podcast. Subscribe, review, rate, comment, post. That's what the algorithms love to see, and that's how we're going to promote the show from the inside as opposed to like buying marketing and stuff like that. So once again, it's been a pleasure. I love doing these for you. If you wouldn't mind leaving a review or a rate or a like or a subscribe, it would mean the world to us. This has been Dollars and Nonsense. If you follow the herd, you will be slaughtered.
Listener, one last thing before you go. Start your journey towards financial security and wealth today. Visit livingwealth.com/escape the bank. Upon completing this course, you'll have all the information that you'll need to see if infinite banking is right for you. Again, go to livingwealth.com/escape the bank.